All right, I think we'll get started. I am Liz Powell. I'm the founder of G2G Consulting, which stands for Government to Growth, a little firm that I started 15 years ago. We're celebrating our 15th anniversary this year. So every year we like to reach out to nonprofits and provide insights and tips on how to do advocacy effectively, how to access funding, build relationships, and make a difference in the world, something that I know you're all very, very committed to. So today, I'm going to turn it over to our experts to give you those insights, and please be sure to use the chat box, ask your questions. We want to make sure that we are meeting your needs and that we are truly helpful today. So thank you all for dialing in. With that, I'll pass it to Andrea.
Thank you, Liz. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for dialing in today. As Liz said, my name is Andrea Harless. I have been with G2G for about 5 years now. I direct our Columbus office. I'm a government affairs manager. So before joining G2G, I worked in the state Senate for a couple of years for a senior member of the Senate. And then I also worked at Franklin County Public Health, our local health department. I work with local, state, and federal clients, but I will tell you that talking about our state budget that's coming up is one of my favorite topics. So I'm super excited to share everything with you today. I have other colleagues that are joining as well, and they'll introduce themselves as we pass this along. But before we get started, I have some polls that I'm going to launch here. These should be pretty easy questions, but we would love to hear a little about you before we get started, which can kind of help guide our presentation today. We go ahead and launch that. Can we see those polls?
Yes.
Perfect. So there are 4 questions here. Love to know where everybody is joining us from today. I know we're going to have a lot of Ohio folks, but also people from outside of Ohio as well. We have a question about kind of what nonprofit sector you work in. I know there are people looking at this thinking I cover all of these, but if you could give your best one, biggest area you're working with, that would be helpful. And then just some easy questions, are you looking to obtain some funding in the Ohio state budget or in the federal budget next year? And are you ready to learn how to lead an advocacy campaign? So I'm going to give this a few minutes, let everybody answer, and we'll keep moving. Another couple seconds here. All right. So it looks like most people here are from Cleveland or Columbus. It's great. We do a lot of work in both of those cities, but also around the state and really the country. Pretty even split: health, education, housing, food security, and access, at-risk youth, all things that we absolutely love. I love it. A lot of people that want to obtain funding or want to learn more, and I was really hoping for 100% on that last question, so I'm glad you did that. Sorry, I don't think I clicked to share the results, but these are our results, so very excited. And like Liz said, if you have questions along the way, please just drop them in the chat box or in the Q&A feature, and we can stop and answer them as we go. All right. So next, this is our agenda for today. We're going to cover a little bit of some government basics, talk about the state operating budget, federal earmarks, and then most importantly, why we're here today, some keys to advocacy and targeting, how to make your voice heard when you are speaking to government about obtaining funding for your organization. We always get a lot of questions about legal activity for nonprofits, which you can and cannot do when talking to government. So we will talk a little bit about that as well. But before we get started there, I know Liz gave a little background about G2G, but I want to tell just a little bit more about us. So G2G stands for Government to Growth, and I absolutely love that because I think it perfectly states what we do at G2G. We work with organizations, nonprofits like yourself to help them work with government in order to grow your mission, to grow your budget, to grow the great work that you're doing. Liz always calls the folks we work with change makers, and I love that because I really do think that everyone we work with is making a change for the better in this world. So we are celebrating our 15th year. I believe that July is actually the month. So this is our 15th birthday, 15th anniversary. Since then, we have led advocacy campaigns. We do State House days at the Ohio Statehouse, but also on Capitol Hill. We do fly-ins. We have crafted legislation, messages, and strategies to change policies to help folks like yourself better serve their organizations and their people. Build key relationships to change the process. This will be a whole section of what we do, but relationships are so important in government. Knowing the right people, having champions, or as I just call them, having friends that'll help you move along is so important. And most importantly, we have made a difference. I think that's why we all love our job so much, because we know we're making a difference every day. Also wanted to share this metric. We have raised $413 million in non-dilutive government funding since Liz started the firm 15 years ago. I think that really speaks volumes about what we've been able to do to make a difference. So that is local, state, and federal funding, but again, just spurring growth all around. We love working with nonprofits. This is just a smattering of some of the organizations that we're currently working with or have worked with in the past. Health, at-risk youth, STEM education, biosciences, food access, all really, really close to our hearts. And we feel super lucky to work with these organizations. All right, now we're going to get into it. So we're going to start with the government basics. We're not going to go to like government class and do the 3 branches of government, but we do something a little different and talk about this puzzle. I love this puzzle because I think it so perfectly encapsulates what you have to do in order to be successful when working with the government. It's just like any puzzle that you do. If you're missing one piece, the picture is not complete. And then you're a little frustrated because you worked really hard, but you're missing that one piece. So having all these pieces is really, really important. One thing that I love when we work with an organization is I always say, I know my pieces of the puzzle really well, and you know your piece as well. And we put it together, we create that perfect picture. So some important things to remember: legislative process, very important to know what's happening, when it's happening, the timeline it's happening on. So you're making those important deadlines and talking to the right people, the right time. Knowing the agencies, knowing leadership, knowing committees. Again, we have a whole slide about targeting, but targeting is really, really important when you are looking at making a budget ask, really making any kind of ask to the government. Advocates and lobbyists, also very important. I love when we can band together with like-minded people who are fighting for the same cause and come together to make it work. So knowing your advocates, knowing the other lobbyists is really important. Your community support and community impact is really important as well. We hear from legislators all the time. We love we love hearing from you. We love hearing from the CEOs or the executive directors of nonprofits. But the people we really want to hear from is the community and the people that are being affected by this, because they are just speaking right from their heart. And you will immediately see that connection with a legislator when they hear from the community, because that's who they want to hear from. Really relevant right now, but knowing polling, media, elections, those current events that are capturing attention, especially in an election year, it is so important to know what's going on. So you are talking to the right people, but again, knowing your timing very well. If you went to the State House tomorrow and tried to do a bunch of meetings with legislators, they're not there. It is an election year. They will really not be back until after the general election. So knowing that is really important, but also planning because of an election. We will have legislators that unfortunately will not come back, whether it's because they're term limited or they don't win their reelection, or for whatever reason they decided they don't want to come back. Knowing those things is so important when you are working with the government. So just staying very in tune with all of that. All right, so now we'll talk about the state operating budget, which I'm sure is why a lot of folks are here today. So in the state of Ohio, we have a 2-year biennial operating budget. So every year in odd numbered years, we work on the budget that will fund the state for the next 2 years. So I just laid out some questions here, kind of the most popular questions about the state operating budget as you're looking at whether or not it's something that you want to pursue. So who is eligible? nonprofits, colleges, universities, state and local government entities, all eligible to receive funding from the state budget. For-profit entities typically are not, things like that, but as a nonprofit, you are eligible to receive funding. What qualifies for funding? So this, because it is an operating budget, the funding here is going to be to continue a program, expand it, create a new program. If you have a program that you are working on, I know it's nonprofits, you probably can think of 10 different things you're working on right now that could have some funding put toward it. But this is for programming dollars, again, continuing, expanding, creating new programs. What this is not for is for capital dollars. So that is something we do in the even numbered years. We actually just did that this past spring, I guess, but no capital dollars. We're not knocking down buildings or building anything new with this money. This is programming dollars. And one thing when we start talking about making an ask, like I said, I know you probably have tons and tons of things you could think of that that you would want to get funding for, but making sure that you have a good ask and that it fits in the right place, that you're going to have champions that will fall behind it. And that is a conversation that, of course, we always have with folks that we work with. How much funding can you request? This is a very wide range. I completely understand. So again, this is a 2-year budget. So you can ask for $150,000 a year for 2 years. So you have $300,000. You can go somewhere in the middle there. Maybe ask for $500,000 a year for 2 years for a total of $1 million. If you are very well known or you have a great relationship with the legislature, asking for more money, is something that you can consider as well. Typically with places that do not have a lot of interaction with the legislature yet, or they're not going to be as well known, they don't have those legislative champions, we typically recommend having a little bit of a lower ask. So I want to share just a quick story here, because this is one of my favorite things that has happened. We have an organization that we have been working with for about 5 years now. The first year we worked with them, they didn't have any relationships with the legislature. Representatives, senators did not really know who they were, had not heard of the great work that they had been doing. So the first year we work with them, they are a statewide organization. So we met with tons and tons of legislators, introduced their mission and what they are doing. And at the end of the state budget 2 cycles ago, they received $500,000 for $250,000 a year for 2 years in the budget, which was great. They did amazing work with that. And because they were able to, going into the next budget cycle, show all the amazing work they were able to do with that funding, we went into a meeting with Senator Matt Dolan, who is the finance chairman of the Senate, said our hellos, said our pleasantries. And going into this budget cycle, we were actually asking for double the amount of funding. So looking at $500,000 a year for 2 years. So making a much bigger ask than we had just 2 years ago. And Senator Dolan goes, guys, I'm going to make this meeting really easy for you. You are a great organization. You do great work. You've kept me in the loop about what you're doing. And you have done great work with this money. I am putting your ask in at your full request. I want you guys to continue to grow and succeed. And that was perfect. That's exactly what we want to hear from legislators. They know who you are. They know you're doing good work. And they know that with more funding, you continue to do even more good work. So I love that story. It's like the best 5-minute meeting that you can have with a legislator who so easily just wants to support you. So what makes a successful budget ask? Talked about this a little bit before. Economic impact, community impact, so important. The state needs to know that you are going to make a difference with that money, having those proven results, going, if you're coming back to legislature, showing what you're able to do with their funding before, but even if it's your first time, what have you been doing with funding? What kind of results are you seeing with the mission that you are, that you're seeking to impact? Support letters are important. Support letters from your community, from your board members, from anyone that can show what you're doing and why it's so important. Having really broad legislator support is also very, very important. If you are a statewide organization, having support from all parts of the state is great. If you are more local, that is fine. Having your local delegation all on board, Democrats, Republicans, House, Senate, all of that. Legislators love when they are not running at it alone, when they have other people they can lean on. That's really helpful to them too, when they're sitting in the room and they say they want to support an amendment or support an organization. If they are hearing that, if leadership is hearing that a lot, it's so important and it's so helpful to move that along. Projects that support the state's priorities, of course, are always considered at a top tier. We know in our state, mental health and addiction, behavioral health, very, very important. Infant mortality, food access, things like that, very, very important. There's a lot more priorities, but having projects that are supporting those priorities is helpful. Your grassroots support, again, hearing from the community, important. This next one was a little harder the past couple of years because of COVID, but bringing the legislators or the administration or the agencies to where you are and showing them in person what you do just absolutely speaks volumes. You could tell them your pitch 10 times, but when they walk into the building and they see it, it really makes a difference. And of course, having support from the governor and the administration is very helpful in your endeavor. I'm going to say again, if you have questions, I know I'm going really fast with a lot of information, so please feel free to drop some questions in the chat box. All right. Little timeline here. So as I said, this is a 2-year budget. We will start really working on it in early next year. The budget has to be signed into law by June 30th, so it can go into effect on July 1st, which is the start of the fiscal year. So it is very fast and furious moving once we get started. But the time to start deciding your budget ask really is right now. Developing messaging and white papers, deciding what your ask is, deciding what is appropriate. That is things that we want to do in advance. We don't want to start doing those in January because then you're a little behind the game there. So developing those strategies beforehand is so important. So then once January and February hit, well, I should say, of course, because it's an election year, there's a little bit of uncertainty of what the makeup of the legislature will look like, who is coming back, who is not coming back. Once we know who is coming back, that's really helpful for us to look at some targets. But once January hits and they formally come back, get sworn in and start doing committee assignments, we know who leadership is and we know who committee leadership is. We know who's sitting on your committee in finance or the committee of jurisdiction. That is when we can really start making those relationships. The governor's budget typically drops in February, and then usually by March, the House will drop their first version of the budget. So we start meeting with legislators February, March to find those champions for our budget amendment. We typically will testify before the House Finance Committee. The House typically has finance subcommittees where they do hearings for specific agencies. We typically will do testifying in front of them so they can hear about it, but we're also meeting with all of those legislators one-on-one as well, so they are hearing from you. We continue those meetings. It really is fast and furious once January hits until the budget is signed, but we continue those meetings in the Senate to find our Senate champions. If you get in the House version of the bill, but maybe at a lower ask than what you wanted, it's our opportunity to go to the Senate and ask for more funding. If you don't get in at the House version, that's our opportunity to go to the Senate and say, hey, we need to get in here so we can be in the final version of the budget. But we'll find our champions in the Senate as well. Same thing as the House. We plan to testify before committees and subcommittees, and then the Senate typically will vote out their version of the budget in May or so. The House and Senate version of the budget will not look alike. They will look very different. So what they do is they confer a conference committee, which is folks from the House, folks from the Senate, Democrats, Republicans, and they kind of just hash it out. They literally go line by line. They say, this is the House version, this is the Senate version, what are we doing here? And they go line by line. So if you're in one version, not the other version, we are pushing to make sure you're in the final version. If you're in one version at a higher number and the other version not, we're pushing to make sure you're getting your ask in at the higher number. And again, by June 30th, we need to have that budget signed by the governor. He has his opportunity to line item veto what he doesn't want to see in the budget, and the fiscal year starts on July 1st. And then really after that, we do our thank you. I was called a thank you tour. We thank people, letters, tours, whatever, media events. And then by the end of the year, we're planning for the next year already. So that is the timeline. That is a very short version of it. And I see you have a question. Will the presentation slides be sent out? Yes, we will send that to everyone that has registered. It's a great question. I think that is all. I'm going to pass to my colleague, Becky. Becky, if there's anything I missed there, Becky is truly such an expert here. So I want to make sure that if I missed anything, she can fill in. But if not, I will pass to Becky. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. No, I think that you hit the major highlights, and I think you can advance to the next slide, actually, if you'd like. So I'm Becky Watts with G2G. I have been here for nearly 15 years, working on this type of advocacy and working with a lot of the nonprofits that you saw on the earlier slide over the years. And it's been a great honor to help advance the work of so many great organizations in their advocacy realm. And before coming to G2G, I was on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., working for then Senator Mike DeWine in his second term in the Senate. He sat on the Appropriations Committee. And at that time, Congress was doing federal earmarks. I was his appropriations director, so I was involved in the evaluation of all the projects that came before us, nearly 2,000 projects that would come from across the state of Ohio. For consideration in the federal earmark process. And then earmarks were banned for the last decade or so, and they have recently come back. So that's what I'm going to be talking about here. But just a little more on my background. Before working in the on Capitol Hill, I worked on Capitol Square in the Ohio Statehouse for the Speaker of the House at the time, and that's where I kind of started my career, although I worked at local government level as well in Northeast Ohio. So I'm a proud Clevelander. I work in our Cleveland office now after having started in DC. And so I'm going to talk here a little bit about federal earmarks for Ohio nonprofits. And a lot of the same principles apply that Andrea spoke of earlier. The difference is in timing and targeting and eligibility, I would say, are the kind of the major differences overall. So federal earmarks, again, have just returned in the last 2 years. There's an effort to make the process much more transparent than it was back in the day when you had your Alaskan bridges to nowhere and some sort of bad apples in the earmark process that led to the banning of the process. But overall, the federal budget, of the entire federal budget that Congress approves on an annual basis, so this is a process that happens every year, it's less than 1/10 of 1% or something like that is how many dollars are actually earmarked for nonprofits across the country. So it's a very small amount of the federal budget, but it does get a lot of the attention. And so in this current newer process, you as a nonprofit are one of the eligible entities. In addition to colleges and universities, state and local government, Congress had their process is different than what Andrea spoke of at the state level in that, again, it's a 1-year funding request. There are 12 bills, there are 12 appropriation bills that go through the process in Congress. They go through the House and they go through the Senate. House members are able to request 15 projects each member of the House of Representatives. All 435 members. So you're getting to know who your member of Congress is, getting to know their state, their district staff, getting to know what their priorities are and whether or not your organization's mission fits in with sort of what their goals are in terms of federal dollars. That is key to this process. If you have a member, for example, we worked with a member of Congress in the Columbus area who, this was Joyce Beatty, this was last year. She was very interested in STEM education and diversity. And we worked with an organization who was doing work in exactly that space. So when we went to talk to her about this process, we presented a project that really aligned with that, but was central to the mission and the core of the organization. So, knowing that is very key, I would say. Additionally, under the what qualifies section here, I would highlight that the matching dollars are not always required, depending on the account in the federal budget, but they are helpful to say, I'm coming to Congress for programmatic dollars, or some cases, construction and equipment dollars. I'm coming to you, to help leverage additional private and community and individual donor foundation dollars. So coming with a budget that is crystal clear as to what you need from Congress and what you're seeking from other sources is very helpful. How much funding can you request? We have on here 50,000 to 3 million. Again, you'll see projects as small as 50,000. You'll also see projects even larger than 3 million. Again, this depends on the nature of the project, the organization, and the impact. If you're going to a Senate office, for example, and you're a statewide organization and have a project that has some sort of statewide angle, you could potentially make a bigger ask. If you're a larger organization with a larger budget, you can make a larger ask. But again, knowing the accounts in the varying bills, the 12 appropriations bills, is helpful as you work through that process. And that's something that we advise on as consultants. This is where we have developed an expertise. But members of Congress also have put out, again, due to this transparent process, there's a lot more available on their websites now. You can see sort of what was eligible in the past. What makes a successful budget ask? Again, community support is very key. We have found in the projects that we've succeeded in securing that having members of the community who are served by your organization send letters, having board members send letters or emails or phone calls to the congressional office. And again, alignment with members' priorities, I think, is really helpful in this case. Key timing for this. So members of Congress, each individual office establishes their own deadlines. Usually these occur in February or March. So that's the deadline by which you need to get your form to them. They each have their own format. A lot of times it's a Google form. That's their deadline, and then they have to go through the process of prioritizing which projects they want to fund, or they want to advance in the funding process, I should say. So while you submit the project in February or March, it's not really the end of your advocacy efforts. It's sort of, it's a key date to know of, but you can continue kind of working the board member angle or the letter writing campaigns beyond that. They then have to submit their priorities to the individual appropriations subcommittees in Congress, usually in April, May timeframe. So in the House, for example, we knew, I think by May of this year, which projects had been advanced. The Senate was a little bit later, and senators do not have the 15 project limit. So they can submit as many as they want to each subcommittee. That doesn't mean that they're going to get all of those funded. For example, Senator Sherrod Brown, in one of the committees, I know I did an analysis of this, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Committee subcommittee, he advanced about 110 projects. And last year in that same subcommittee, he had about 15 or so that were funded. So May through November, when the committee markups happen, and that's usually when you find out sort of if you've gotten to the next step. And then technically the bills are supposed to be done by the end of September because the congressional fiscal year, the federal fiscal year starts October 1. But Congress pretty much never has their bills done by that time. And they enact continuing resolutions to keep the government funded. Sometimes that's when you start hearing about, potential government shutdowns. If there's a hang up between the administration and the congressional leadership. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the
Sorry, there was a request to put the closed captions on, but I
Oh.
don't know if I have mine set up to do that.
Okay, I'm
Can we-
seeing them now.
Can we see them now? Okay, sorry about that. I didn't have the right setup. I hope that works for whomever asked. Sorry, Becky.
No problem. I think it's great. And maybe I'm wondering if I'm not speaking loud enough. So that's really the overview. So timing, for example, in terms of when the process concludes, usually it's by December or so. Last year, the FY22 projects didn't get finalized until March of this year. So they were really delayed in that process, but that varies year to year. Next slide, please, Andrea. So we just pulled a handful of federal earmarks that were funded last year in this federal earmark process to give you a sense of kind of a variety of things. Again, these were funded in different federal bills. Pass Foundation, the STEM 22 Equity in the STEM Workforce, that's the one I was talking about earlier. For 500,000. These are not all our projects, by the way, but the Jennings Center for Older Adults was another project that we worked on. That was in the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Subcommittee. It was funded at $700,000. Again, that was for an equipment related purchase. You'll see you have some workforce development type of projects, the Greater Toledo Community Foundation, Industrial Solar Community Project. You have the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. You have museums, entities like that get funding through this process. Healthcare, education, again, all of interest, and certainly, while it's a very competitive process, I think the side benefit, even if you don't get funded, is that you really develop a strong relationship with your member of Congress because you have something, an ask to go there with. But hopefully you have invited the members' district staff out to visit your site throughout the course of making this ask. Next slide, please.
Becky, we do have a question I think would be great to answer. So we have someone that said, we submitted earmarks to all representatives and senators in Maryland and did not receive anything. We offered a scaled, it went away. What happened? Oh, sorry. We offered a scaled budget when we did our debrief with senators' offices, and we were told everything was perfect. However, we did not have signed commitments from the public school system. Do you have any suggestions for next year?
Well, that's interesting that they gave that particular feedback about the signed commitments from the public school system. I guess I would have to understand a little bit better, what your request was and what they were seeking. But it sounds like you do work in the education space, and they wanted to know specifically how the public school districts were, how formalized of an engagement it was. I guess that's excellent that you went through that process in terms of getting the feedback, and to the extent that you are able to propose something similar next year with those commitments, if that's a possibility. I would say, it sounds like you're on the right track there. I I think that's interesting, you know, that was specifically what they were seeking. And I guess I would, as you're going forward, it sounds like you've developed a good relationship with the senator's office and can kind of keep them abreast of your developments. And I would recommend doing so to see if you're kind of meeting the criteria that they're seeking in that, in the debrief that they gave you. Not sure if that answers that, but. So a couple of things we just wanted to talk to you about and go over here is that we find our keys to advocacy. First step, we like this graphic because it sort of shows the steps in this process, an assessment of your own needs. So in starting to think about what you approach your member of Congress or your member of your state legislature with, you have to think about what your needs are and how those align with what is available through public funding or available through public policy change. And we find that members of the legislature often and in Congress say they have knowledge that's a mile wide but an inch deep. So to the extent that you as a subject matter expert in the field you're working in can come to them with a very concise explanation of what your needs are and how you're proposing that their office can help you figure out the solution or get you funding for the solution, that is extremely helpful, or for a policy change that can help you reach that solution as well. Again, there tend to be more generalists, and so you as a subject matter expert need to be able to articulate your needs very clearly. Targeting, second step, very, very key. Again, understanding that member's priorities, if you're talking to a Democrat or a Republican, what their priorities are, knowing what committees they sit on, and what jurisdiction that committee has. If you're talking to the right person, they might say, this is all great, but I don't, you have to be talking to XYZ person who is chair of the finance committee. And understanding that process in your individual state legislature or member of Congress, they represent their individual organizations in their districts, but they also have these committee assignments. So those are very key to knowing about in your targeting efforts. Messaging, again, concise. We like to recommend laying things out in a 1 to 2 page document with a sort of overview of what you're requesting, what the problem is that you're trying to address, what the solution is that you're proposing, and what the results are that you expect to get out of working with this government target. Outreach to those you serve, the community, your board, donors, and the media. Again, we've touched on this a few times. This is very critical. Those you serve, your boards, those are a key part of your advocacy efforts. They are the ones who can help deliver that message in a way that's often resonates with members, their constituents. They are people that are impacted, and your boards are often well connected and you may not even know it. So spending the time with doing an assessment of your board in terms of who their government contacts are can be critically important. Engagement with decision makers at meetings, tours, and events. Again, bringing them out to your sites, getting them involved in roundtables, discussions that you're having, making them feel like they are a part of sort of the growth of your organization. And then follow up, just staying on top of them. And a lot of times, we work with a ton of very busy CEOs of nonprofits who they or their staff may not have the capacity or bandwidth to do that. And that's understandable, but that's a very key part of it. And that's something we do a lot of. Polite persistence, we call it, is a key part of this game. Next slide, please.
We do have one question that I think would be good to answer live. So for state and federal earmarks, do we need city and county support?
That is always very helpful, but it's not always the case that you need it. It really depends in the federal world, it depends on the nature of your request. For example, if you're a municipality doing a road transportation related process, a project, being on the state's transportation plan, that is a key component. But again, in the nonprofit world, not as much. It does not hurt, generally speaking, it never hurts to have that multi-layered government support, because it lends credibility to your organization. But again, it's sort of can be chicken and egg sort of a situation, and it can also be tricky. Like, you also don't want to show that you're getting so much from the state, therefore you wouldn't need the federal. So it's a little bit of a delicate dance. But generally speaking, if I'm working with an organization that has support from the local or state or county level and going to Congress, that's generally speaking very helpful. Targeting, we talked a little bit about this again. Your legislators, your members of Congress, your state legislators, based on your physical location. So that's number one. That should be your first line of communication is through them. So get to know whomever that person is, both in the House and Senate. Strongly recommend that. And then, if you have a larger footprint in multiple counties, multiple cities, getting to know all of them, making sure they know your organization. And then leadership in the next one. So at the state legislative level, we find that this is very helpful. In Ohio, for example, we have a supermajority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate. It's really a handful of people at the top who are making a lot of the decisions. Them hearing from your local legislators is helpful, but also you can develop your own relationships directly with them, especially if you have a multi-county organization that has a larger footprint. Committee leadership, again, developing a rapport with the House and Senate Finance Committee chairwomen, and subcommittee chairs and ranking members, also very helpful, so that they're hearing from your organization too. Getting to know legislators with similar interests. So if you are working in, for example, an area of maternal and infant health, knowing, are there caucuses that are focused on that? Are there members of the legislature who have introduced legislation on this topic? That is someone you would probably want to go speak to about your organization and what you're doing. State agencies and the Office of the Governor and Lieutenant Governor, also very key. They're, in terms of the state budget, they're all very much a part of that process. Once it goes to the legislature, that's sort of when the public has an opportunity for input, but they are monitoring it entirely from behind the scenes as that process is going forward. So keeping them abreast of what you are asking for in that process is very key. And they also, the governor and lieutenant governor, they have regional staff in addition, just like members of Congress. So those are good people to get to know in that process. Next slide. And I think I'm passing it now to my colleague, Greg Cathcart.
Great. Thanks a lot, Becky. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here. So I'm Greg Cathcart. I'm also in our Midwest office in Cleveland, Ohio. I have spent my entire career in the nonprofit sector and actually started an internal advocacy program at a fairly large organization here in the Cleveland area that had statewide services. And we secured some grant funding to actually launch an advocacy program in-house. for 3 years, and then that program got sustained within the organization beyond that. We were pretty successful early on getting some state operating money, like Andrea has outlined here. We also lobbied the federal government at the time and got earmarks back then, and worked for some literacy programs, things like that. I've got my master's in public administration and nonprofit management, and I've been with G2G for about 6 years now. And prior to that, I was the legislative director at a state membership association, doing their policy work, but then also managed a couple smaller nonprofits that had a combined worth of $5 million. And one of them was a small charitable foundation that was kind of in a niche industry. So when we do these webinars, we get often asked, what can I do and what can I do as a nonprofit? And I do want to note from this slide that there is a difference between what you as individual CEO or person can do versus what the nonprofit organization can do. So there's nothing that would limit me as a CEO of a nonprofit to get involved and to do political activity, as long as I'm not crossing the line that's part of my nonprofit. So one of the most common questions is, one, as a nonprofit, can I lobby? And then another common statement we often hear is, well, my nonprofit doesn't advocate or lobby because we can lose our nonprofit status. And just wanted to kind of put those myths to rest, that the federal tax laws actually allow charitable nonprofits to engage in legislative lobbying. The question becomes, how much time are you devoting to it? So right off the bat, the federal code allows you, there's a substantial test for how much you're spending on lobbyists and lobbying. And you can see here that if it's less than 20% of your total budget, you're within, those realms. I've been at organizations where they wanted a little bit different kind of security, so to speak, that wasn't just the substantial test. And I just throw it out there that there is a 501H election status with the IRS, that it's a voluntary free election status, so to speak. You just fill out a form and you basically declare, I'm going to do this 501 election status. You continue to maintain your 501c3 nonprofit, but instead of having a substantial budget test, it becomes more of an expenditure test. So there's some nuances to it. So just wanted to throw that out. The other things that you can do is certainly educate and meet with your legislators or your public officials. That's certainly within the realm of possibility and doesn't kind of ding you as being out of bounds. Absolutely doing the tours and speaking engagements that Becky and Andrea have talked about. Nonprofits can actually work on issues and levies. I can remember a couple nonprofits that I worked at, we were actually very involved in the Health and Human Service levy, volunteering for that. So that's not considered something that you're prohibited from doing. Absolutely can do voter drives, get out the vote, voter education, things like that. Stuff that your nonprofit, so talking about you and your role as a nonprofit employee, your nonprofit cannot do political activities such as candidate endorsements. So you never ever want to put out something that endorses one candidate over another. In fact, I try to err on the side of caution that if we're inviting a legislator out and we're in that election cycle, that if I'm inviting the incumbent, I'm also inviting the opponent. And then if they decline to come out, I've at least covered bases that I'm not showing any sort of favoritism over the incumbent versus the challenger. And that's a little bit more around the election cycle. But once they're in office, you can invite them, whoever you want. Definitely don't want to be writing checks on companies check heads. You don't want to give an organizational donation from your nonprofit or any sort of loans. Even this also applies to in-kind contributions. So, offering the use of your facility or donating your staff time or use of equipment to help out public officials, especially in their electioneering process. And same goes for kind of social media pages. So just kind of being cautious around those kinds of things. But the main takeaway from this is as a nonprofit, you are legally allowed to lobby and you are legally allowed to advocate. In fact, let's go to the next slide, and just wanted to show you that the grant making for community impact project through this National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy has actually looked at this. And one of the reasons, they have looked at what do these investments in advocacy, community organizing, and civic engagement really bring back to the community. And they examined this impact-oriented nonprofits in different parts of the country. And they documented that there's about $26.6 billion in benefits for taxpayers and communities in these 13 states. So this is a real localized, well, not real localized, but it's not every 50 state in the country. But they found that for every dollar that grant makers and other donors invest in policy and civic engagement, there's a $115 return in the community benefit. So let's go to the next slide. So just to kind of wrap this up, I know we want to leave some time for questions and answers. Just want to talk through some of these items here. And if you have all of the slides we have are great. This one really starts to kind of encapsulate things. So Becky talked about a needs assessment, and this is kind of back to the basics, going into detail of, do we need money? How much is it for? What is it for? How does that meet local need? And then starting to think about that in terms of, okay, who in political office needs to know about this? Am I going after local money, or am I going after state money? Am I going after federal money? Does it have a statewide impact? Does it have a national impact? So really starting to kind of assess that before you actually make your ask. We've talked a lot about how the system works, and right now we're really focused on how the budget process works. If you're new to this and you're in, I know we've got folks calling in from Maryland. We have several from Ohio. Be thinking about other networks. I know that the Advocates for Ohio's Future and the Center for Community Solutions, there are some networks that can plug into and can give you some kind of network-based oomph, so to speak, to your lobbying efforts, because they'll do some advocacy on bigger statewide issues that your organization can become a part of. But when we're talking about your nonprofit, which is really what we're here to talk about, is how can your organization benefit from these? Understanding the budget process and the timing, all is very important. The third item is this target list. I have to admit, this is my favorite part of the whole lobbying experience. If you think of stakeholder mapping, this is it. Who are the key legislators that we need to know? Obviously, you want to know your locals, but beyond that, who sits on committees? Where is your bill or your policy going to go? And so getting to know those committees. With term limits, you're always building relationships. So there's an ongoing effort to continually educate lawmakers and build those relationships just because of term limits. When we look at messaging, Becky, we started, when we work with an organization, we start with this messaging around issue, problem, and solution. And we do a one-pager that we like to call a white paper. And this really hones in on what are we trying to solve and offer solutions. And then you also want to have your 30-second elevator pitch ready to go. So if you're, happen to be at an event, you might only get 30 seconds with the legislator or the policymaker. And you want to be able to talk about that very succinctly and be thinking in terms of how is this funding going to impact our community? What's the connection to that spending to the district? If it's a policy issue, explain that issue and the solution. One of the things that we hear often when we talk to legislators, and Becky touched on this, is that they're not experts in all of these areas. They're basically generalists. It's very rare that they're going to have a deep expertise on your issue, unless maybe somebody served on a mental health board or something and they're coming in with that background. You assume that they don't know much about what your organization does or what the issues are. But the other important thing is to come to the table with solutions rather than just coming with a problem and dumping that on their table. You want to be able to say, okay, here's the issue, here's the problem, here is our recommended solution. Another important component to this is being willing to work together and compromise. And this messaging also includes who's the best messenger. You know, maybe it is you as the staff person, but maybe it's your CEO. Maybe it's some of the families that use your service. Maybe it's a board member who knows these individuals, and so on. So, you know, you can start to see where we're targeting certain people we want to talk to, but then now we want to build on what are we telling them and who should be telling them. This building relationships is so important. And what I want to say about that is you want to make friends before you need them. So if you don't know your legislators and you're planning to go ask for money, you'd be in a better position to spend some time now before you ask them, and just so that they know your organization and their first encounter with you is not you asking them for money or for a particular program or even to change a certain policy. So the takeaway there is make your friends before you need them. We've talked about knowing the process. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We've talked about that a lot. Part of relationship building is having your elected officials out and doing these staff tours. One thing I want to mention here is never underestimate the importance of staff. I have seen company leaders come to DC or go to the State House and get a little miffed and upset that they're not meeting with the public official. Just remember that a lot of these staff the staff are the gatekeepers, and to treat them with respect. And a lot of times, if you can convince a staff member that your issue is important, they become a champion for you with the elected officials. So that's something, just kind of a trick of the trade to not lose sight of. Definitely engaging the community as part of your strategy. This ties back to who's your messenger, and then at what point do you bring them in? You know, maybe it's not at the beginning, but maybe it's during these committee hearings, or maybe it's after the bill has been signed, not signed, after the, you know, the bill's gone through some different processes. Just where do you connect them in? As far as follow-up and strategy and staying in touch, you know, you've heard the saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So you definitely want to stay on their radar. You don't want to be the obnoxious wheel. You want to stay at top of mind. You want to keep them in the loop. You want to maintain that communication. So don't assume that just because you've talked to them once, that it's a one and done. You want to find reasons to come back and talk to them and interact with them. And that's where all of these other things we've talked about, as far as bringing them out to your organization, adding them to your newsletter, sending them articles from a paper and saying, hey, did you see this? This relates to the work that we're doing. Or in a particular case, if there's a tragedy, saying, oh my gosh, look at this tragedy in our community. This is what we work on. This is how we can solve the problem. Absolutely being aware of politics. You know, I come from a social work background. I didn't necessarily have a political background, but you've got to be savvy about who's running the state. So, you know, if you're trying to work on policy and your affiliation is only with the Democrats in Ohio, for example, you know, you got to make friends on the other side of the aisle, because they're the ones that have control over the committees and in the governor's office. So to the extent you can, work both sides of the aisle, find your issue to be bipartisan, and kind of stay out of that, you know, kind of fringe stuff where you know, it might not help advance your cause. And then lastly, never ever give up. And there are so many examples of that. So I'll just pause there. I know we're coming up on time, and we can go to the next slide.
All right. So we do have two questions that I wanted to answer live, and Becky and Greg, please feel free to chime in if I miss anything. The first question, I love this question. If we hire a firm to lobby for us, do we still need to do all this advocacy ourselves? I like to think of what we do as a team effort. And, you know, I mean that in that we both have our pieces that we do. So of course, when we're working on messaging and a white paper and things like that, we do work on that together. It is important for us to know what you do and what your ask is, and get to learn your organization, you know, inside and out. But at the end of the day, there's nobody that can tell your story better than you. So typically when we work with someone, we do ask the CEO or the executive director or whomever they kind of appoint to work in the advocacy role to do meetings with us. So when we're meeting with legislators, whether it's a phone call or a Zoom or going to the State House, we do like to have them there to give that pitch about what they do and to answer questions, because sometimes legislators are asked questions that, you know, we simply wouldn't know the answer to, because, you know, we don't work at your organization. So it's helpful to have you there for that. We also sometimes will ask you to come to events with us just to show our support for legislators. But of course, there is a lot that is done behind the scenes. And, you know, I think that extra piece that makes a lot of these asks successful, and just doing the targeting and setting up the meetings, having the behind the scenes communications with like leadership staff and budget staff and administrative staff and governor staff that we will do, that we will sometimes do on our own, you know, events that we will attend, you know, people that we talk to as we're pursuing the ask. So there's definitely a team effort. It is certainly not that you hire someone and it is just hands off. I think any lobbyist would tell you that that would be really hard to be successful if the organization is completely hands off. So it's great to work on this as a team, but certainly there is a lot that comes off your plate when you do work with a lobbyist. And then the other question, which I also wanted to answer live, does the CEO and or others need to register as a lobbyist at the state or federal level? So the answer typically here is going to be no. If you have hired a lobbyist, we would be registered lobbyists for your organization, but the CEO and the executive director, because they are under the threshold of how many hours they spend lobbying, would not have to register themselves. I don't know if there are any other, I hope that answered those questions. Again, Becky, Greg, if you have anything to add, please do. And if there are any more questions, please drop them in the box. If not, the last thing I wanted to do, so we are kind of doing this as a series. We have done these webinars in the past, but we want to continue to build on these because there's a lot more that we can share. So today we're just kind of talking about the basics. We talked a lot about Ohio today because we do a lot of work in Ohio. Then our next couple parts, we are going to focus a little less on Ohio and more on just advocacy in general. So for this part 2, we actually are going to invite some clients of ours that have worked with us and hear what they have learned as an advocate at the State House and at the in the Capitol. So hearing from them, we'll do like some questions with them. I think it's a great opportunity for you to ask questions to somebody, to appear really as a nonprofit. And then in our part 3, we are holding this after the election. So I have a little better idea of what's things are going to look like going into the next year or two, and focus this really on the federal budget, federal appropriations, and what's happening in DC.
Andrea, real quick, there are a couple of questions for the state budget. Is it per year amounts or total amounts over 2 years?
Yeah, typically when we make the ask, we do ask like per year. So we'll say like 125,000 per year for 2 years. Because when you look at the budget breakdown, it will say like fiscal year X and fiscal year Y. So we do that. It just depends on how you word it. So sometimes we'll say 250,000 for 2 years, or we'll say like 125 per each year, but that is the way they break it down, is in 2 years. And some people will say like they want 75,000 for year 1 and maybe nothing for year 2. I don't necessarily recommend that. I think it's nice to have 2 even numbers to make your messaging easier, but if that works, that is something that can be done. Any other questions? Great. So we have some contact information here. If you do have any more questions, we will send out the slides afterwards. We will also have a recording on this that we will likely put up in a couple different places. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to us if there's anything you think of later. And if not, we really appreciate your time. I know you guys are all so busy, so appreciate you taking an hour this afternoon to hear from us. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.